The metallic taste of recycled air filled my lungs as consciousness slowly returned, each breath a labored effort against the oppressive weight of disorientation. My eyelids felt like lead shutters, refusing to open despite my mind's desperate commands. When they finally parted, the sight that greeted me defied every expectation I had harbored about waking up. I wasn't in my quarters aboard the Resilience. I wasn't anywhere recognizable at all. The chamber around me hummed with an alien energy that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, its walls composed of a material that shifted between transparency and opacity like living glass. Bioluminescent veins traced intricate patterns across the surfaces, casting an ethereal blue-green glow that hurt to look at directly. The air itself seemed thick with possibility and danger, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand on end. "Commander?" The voice cut through my confusion like a lifeline. Lieutenant Sarah Chen lay on a similar platform 15 feet away, her own struggle with consciousness evident in the way she fought to sit upright. Her usually pristine uniform was disheveled, her dark hair escaped from its regulation bun, but her eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had made her my most trusted officer. "Chun." My voice came out as a croak, throat raw as if I'd been screaming. "Status report." She managed to push herself into a sitting position, swaying slightly before finding her balance. "Unknown, sir. Last memory is running diagnostics on the quantum drive before the jump to Kepler 442. Then, this." She gestured weakly at our surroundings, her engineering mind already working to process what seemed impossible. I forced myself upright, muscles protesting every movement. The platform beneath me was warm, almost body temperature, and responded to my weight with minute adjustments that kept me perfectly balanced. Whatever technology created it was far beyond human understanding. "Equipment?" Chen patted down her uniform, checking for her standard gear. "Sidearms gone. Comm units dead. Emergency beacons not responding." She pulled out her tricorder, its screen flickering with static. "Whatever brought us here scrambled our tech pretty thoroughly." The implications hit me like a physical blow. No communication with command. No way to call for extraction. No idea where we were or how we'd gotten here. In 23 years of service, I faced hostile aliens, cosmic phenomena that defied physics, and odds that would have broken lesser crews. But this felt different. This felt personal. "Sir." Chen's voice carried a note of wonder that made me look up from my own inventory. She was standing now, moving toward what appeared to be a window or viewing port in the far wall. "You need to see this." I joined her at the transparent barrier, and my breath caught in my throat. Beyond the window stretched a vista that belonged in the fever dreams of cosmologists and the nightmares of spacers. We were floating in what appeared to be a vast sphere, its inner surface covered in structures that defied architectural logic. Towers spiraled upward in impossible helixes, their surfaces crawling with the same bioluminescent patterns that decorated our chamber. Between them, bridges of pure energy arced through space, carrying streams of light that pulsed like arterial flow. And we weren't alone. Scattered throughout the sphere, suspended in what seemed to be bubbles of localized atmosphere, were dozens of other chambers like ours. Some contained figures I could barely make out at this distance, while others appeared empty. The scale was overwhelming. The sphere had to be hundreds of kilometers in diameter, large enough to house a small moon. "Commander." Chen's voice was steady, but I could hear the underlying tension. "Look at Sector 7, upper quadrant." I followed her gaze and felt my blood turn to ice. One of the distant chambers contained what was unmistakably a human figure, but something was wrong with the perspective. The person inside appeared to be screaming, their mouth open in a silent wail, but their body was contorted in ways that suggested either extreme pain or impossible physics. As I watched, the figure seemed to flicker, as if reality itself was uncertain about their existence. "How many others?" I asked quietly. Chen had pulled out a pair of emergency binoculars, somehow spared from whatever had disabled our other equipment. She scanned the visible chambers methodically, her engineering precision evident even in crisis. 47 visible chambers with occupants. Mix of species I can identify: human, what looks like Zephyrian, possibly some Cordari. But, sir. She paused, adjusting the focus. Some of the chambers contain things I can't identify. And some of the occupants don't look right. Before I could ask for clarification, the chamber around us shuddered. Not a mechanical vibration, but something deeper, as if the fabric of space itself had hiccuped. The bioluminescent patterns on the walls flared brighter, and, for a moment, I could swear I heard something that might have been music or might have been screaming, carried on frequencies that human ears weren't designed to process. Then, impossibly, a voice spoke directly into our minds. Welcome, specimens, to the crucible of essence. You have been selected for participation in the Great Refinement. Your species shows potential for elevation beyond your current limitations. The process will begin momentarily. The mental contact felt like ice water flooding my skull, each word etched with crystalline clarity despite being in no language I recognized. Chen stumbled backward, her hand pressed to her temple, tears streaming down her face. I fared little better, my knees buckling under the assault of alien thought patterns that human minds weren't equipped to handle. You will be tested. You will be broken. You will be remade. Those who survive the process will emerge as something greater than what they were. Those who do not, will contribute their essence to those who do. What do you want? I managed to force the thought outward, hoping whatever entity was communicating with us could receive as well as transmit. We want nothing. We are the architects of evolution. We have guided species across the galaxy for eons beyond your comprehension. Your kind has reached a critical juncture, you stand at the threshold between greatness and extinction. This process will determine which path you take. The mental voice carried undertones of vast age and implacable purpose. This wasn't a malevolent force, I realized with growing horror. This was something that genuinely believed it was helping us, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying than simple evil. The trials will begin with an examination of your fundamental nature. What makes you human? What weaknesses define you? What strengths lie dormant within you? You will confront these questions not through meditation or philosophy, but through direct experience. The chamber shuddered again, and the walls began to shift. The bioluminescent patterns rearranged themselves, forming new configurations that hurt to look at directly. The very air seemed to thicken, becoming viscous and resistant to movement. Commander Michael Torres. Age 37. Service record indicates exceptional leadership capabilities and tactical innovation under extreme stress. However, your psychological profile reveals significant self-doubt and fear of failure stemming from the loss of your first command. These weaknesses will be addressed. I felt my blood freeze. They knew my name. My history. The classified details of the Vanguard incident that I'd never spoken about, even to Chen. The memory I'd spent years burying surged to the surface unbidden, the faces of the crew members who'd died because of my miscalculation, the weight of command that had nearly broken me before I learned to carry it properly. Lieutenant Sarah Chen. Age 29. Brilliant engineering mind with an intuitive grasp of systems integration that borders on supernatural. However, you carry deep-seated abandonment issues that manifest as an inability to trust others with critical tasks. This will also be addressed. Chen's face had gone pale, her usual confident demeanor cracking as whatever entity was probing our minds touched on wounds she'd never admitted to having. I could see her hands shaking as memories she thought safely buried were dragged into the light. The process is not punishment. It is not torture, though you will experience both. It is evolution. Those aspects of your psyche that serve no purpose, that weaken you, that hold you back from your potential, these will be systematically identified and removed. What remains will be purified, strengthened, perfected. And, if we refuse? Chen's voice was barely above a whisper, but the defiance in it was unmistakable. Refusal is not possible. You are here. The process has begun. However, your approach to the trials will determine not only your survival, but the nature of what you become. Embrace the transformation, and you will emerge as exemplars of your species. Resist it, and you will be broken down to your component elements and recycled into the matrix. The walls around us suddenly became transparent, revealing the vast network of chambers stretching into the distance. As I watched in horrified fascination, one of the distant bubbles flared with brilliant light. When it faded, the chamber was empty except for a slowly dissipating cloud of what looked like golden particles. Your first trial begins now. The floor beneath us vanished. I had a split second to register the sensation of falling before the world exploded into chaos. We tumbled through space that wasn't quite space, past structures that might have been buildings or might have been thoughts made manifest. The laws of physics seemed to apply sporadically here, gravity pulling in multiple directions at once while time moved in stuttering, irregular beats. Chen and I fell together through this impossible realm, our hands finding each other instinctively as we plummeted toward an uncertain fate. Below us, a new environment was taking shape, a twisted mirror of somewhere I recognized with growing dread. The bridge of the Vanguard. My first command. The place where 43 good people had died because I'd made the wrong call at the critical moment. We landed hard on the familiar deck plating, the impact driving the breath from my lungs. But, as I struggled to my feet, I realized this wasn't just a recreation. The air carried the same acrid smell of burnt electronics and venting atmosphere I remembered from that terrible day. The alarm klaxons wailed with the exact pitch that still haunted my dreams. And, standing at the tactical station, her face a mask of barely controlled panic, was Lieutenant Commander Jessica Walsh. Commander Torres. The voice was exactly as I remembered it, professional, competent, but with an edge of desperation that she'd tried so hard to hide. Centauri fleet has broken through the outer perimeter. We've lost the Defiant and the Courage. Orders, sir? I stared at her in shock. Walsh had been dead for 15 years, vaporized along with the rest of my crew when the Vanguard's reactor had gone critical. But, here she stood, as real as the day I'd first met her, waiting for the orders that would determine whether humanity's first colony would survive or fall to the Centauri assault. This isn't real, I whispered. Sir? Walsh's expression shifted to concern. Commander, I need orders. The Centauri are moving to flank us. If we don't act in the next 90 seconds, they'll have a clear shot at the civilian evacuation ships. I knew what came next. I'd lived this moment 1,000 times in nightmares and guilt-ridden memories. I would order the Vanguard to cover the retreat, positioning us between the colony ships and the enemy fleet. The Centauri would target our reactor, and my decision to maintain position instead of maneuvering would doom us all. 43 lives lost because I'd prioritized the mission over the safety of my crew. But something was different this time. Chen stood beside me on the bridge, her presence an anchor to reality in this twisted recreation. And, in her eyes, I saw not the lieutenant who'd been assigned to my crew yesterday, but the woman who'd served under me for 5 years, who'd watched me make impossible decisions under extreme pressure, who'd seen me grow from the broken shell of a commander into someone worthy of the uniform. Sir, Chen said quietly, her voice carrying a meaning only I would understand. You're not the same man who stood here 15 years ago. The mental voice of our captors spoke again, its tone clinically interested. Fascinating. Most subjects immediately repeat their original choices, trapped by the weight of their past failures. But, you hesitate. Why? I looked around the bridge, taking in details I'd been too overwhelmed to notice the first time. Walsh's tactical display showed information that didn't match my memories, fleet positions that were slightly different, enemy vectors that had subtle variations. This wasn't just a recreation of my past. It was a test designed to see if I'd learned anything from my failure. Because, I said aloud, addressing both Walsh and the unseen entity that held us, I'm not here to relive my mistakes. I'm here to prove that I've grown beyond them. I turned to Walsh, seeing her clearly for the first time in decades, not as a symbol of my failure, but as the competent officer she'd been, deserving of a commander who trusted her judgment. Walsh, what's your tactical assessment? All options on the table. Her expression shifted from desperate pleading to sharp professionalism. Sir, if we can coordinate with the Resolute, we might be able to execute a pincer movement. Draw the Centauri into a crossfire while the evacuation completes. It's risky, we'd be operating at the edge of our reactor's safety parameters. The old me would have dismissed the plan as too dangerous, would have tried to shoulder the entire burden myself. The old me had been so afraid of losing people under my command that I'd made decisions based on fear rather than tactical necessity. "Do it," I ordered. "Signal the Resolute. Coordinate the attack." Walsh's face lit up with relief and determination. "Aye, sir. Transmitting attack pattern now." The bridge simulation played out differently this time. The Vanguard and the Resolute worked in perfect synchronization, their combined firepower creating a corridor that allowed the civilian ships to escape. When the Centauri tried to break through our formation, we were ready for them, our maneuvers precise and coordinated. And, when it was over, when the last evacuation ship had jumped to safety and the Centauri fleet had been forced to withdraw, the bridge of the Vanguard faded away like morning mist. I found myself standing with Chen in what appeared to be a garden, a place of impossible beauty where crystalline trees grew toward a sky that showed all the colors of the electromagnetic spectrum simultaneously. "Interesting," the mental voice mused. "You did not simply overcome your past failure. You transformed it into wisdom. The guilt that has driven you for 15 years, it remains, but it no longer controls you. This is unexpected. What happens now?" Chen asked, her voice carrying the steady tone that meant she was analyzing our situation with her engineer's precision. "Now, Lieutenant Chen, we examine your fundamental nature. The wounds that drive you to excellence but also to isolation. The fear of abandonment that makes you reluctant to delegate, to trust, to allow others to share the burden of critical tasks." The garden around us shifted, walls rising from the crystalline ground to form the outline of a familiar space, Chen's childhood home, recreated in perfect detail down to the faded wallpaper and the smell of her mother's cooking. But there was something wrong with the scene, a sense of impending loss that made the air heavy with unspoken grief. Chen's breath caught as a young girl, herself at perhaps 8 years old, ran into the room, her face bright with excitement. "Mama! Papa! I fixed the old radio. It's working again." The child Chen held up a battered transistor radio, its antenna straightened and its case carefully taped where it had been cracked. Her parents looked up from their dinner preparations, and I could see the pride and love in their faces as they examined their daughter's work. "Very good, little engineer," her father said, ruffling her hair. "You have magic hands, just like your grandfather." But, even as the scene played out, I could see the tears forming in Chen's eyes. She knew what came next, the accident that would take her parents when she was 12, leaving her to bounce between relatives who saw her as a burden rather than a blessing. The origin of the abandonment issues that had shaped her entire approach to relationships and responsibility. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't watch this again." "But, you must," the mental voice insisted. "This moment shaped you, defined your approach to trust and independence. But, like your commander, you are not the child who experienced this trauma. You have grown beyond your wounds. The question is, can you recognize that growth?" The scene shifted, time accelerating through the familiar tragedy. Chen's parents died in the transport accident, and young Sarah was sent to live with an aunt who made it clear she was an unwelcome obligation. I watched my lieutenant's face as she witnessed her own childhood unfold, the loneliness, the constant moving between relatives, the gradual realization that she could only depend on herself. But, then, something unexpected happened. The scene shifted again, showing a moment I'd never heard Chen mention, a day when she was 15, working on a broken replicator in her latest temporary home. An older cousin, someone I didn't recognize, sat down beside her. "You know," the cousin said gently, "it's okay to let other people help sometimes. Being strong doesn't mean carrying everything alone." I saw Chen, the real Chen, standing beside me, stiffen with surprise. I'd forgotten about Marcus. He was the only one who. "Who what?" I prompted gently. "Who saw past the defensive walls I'd built. Who understood that my need to do everything myself wasn't strength, it was fear." She wiped tears from her eyes. "He tried to teach me that trust wasn't weakness. I was too afraid to listen at the time." The simulation continued, showing Chen's journey through the academy, her early assignments, her gradual development into the exceptional officer I knew. But now I could see the moments she'd glossed over in her personnel files, the times when colleagues had offered assistance and she'd declined, the projects she'd shouldered alone rather than risk disappointment, the slowly building reputation as someone brilliant but difficult to work with. Until she'd been assigned to my crew. The scene shifted to show our first mission together, a routine maintenance assignment on a deep space relay. I watched from this new perspective as Chen struggled with a particularly complex repair, her face set in lines of stubborn determination even as the problem clearly exceeded her capabilities. I saw myself approach, offering to help or to call in additional expertise. And I saw Chen's initial refusal, the automatic defensive response that had served her so poorly for so many years. But then, and this was the moment that had begun our professional partnership, I saw myself sit down beside her anyway. "I'm not offering because I think you can't handle it," my past self had said. "I'm offering because this problem will go faster with two minds on it, and we're on a schedule. Your choice." The Chen standing beside me in the simulation smiled through her tears. "You didn't make it about my competence or my trust issues. You made it about efficiency and practical necessity." "It worked," I replied. "You've been letting people help ever since. Grudgingly, but you've been doing it." "Remarkable," the mental voice interjected. "You have both identified the mechanisms by which you have overcome your fundamental weaknesses. This level of self-awareness is unusual. Most species require significantly more aggressive intervention." The simulation faded, leaving us standing in what appeared to be a vast library. The shelves stretched impossibly high, filled with books whose pages seemed to turn themselves, their contents shifting and changing as I watched. The air hummed with the whisper of turning pages and the scratch of pens on paper. "What is this place?" Chen asked, her engineering mind already cataloging the impossible architecture. "This is the archive of potentials," our unseen captor replied. "Every choice, every possibility, every path not taken, all are recorded here. You have passed the first phase of testing by demonstrating growth beyond your fundamental limitations. Now comes the more interesting question: what will you become when those limitations are completely removed?" A book materialized in the air before us, its pages blank except for two names written in flowing script, Commander Michael Torres and Lieutenant Sarah Chen. As I watched, words began to appear on the page, writing themselves in real time. Subject: Torres has demonstrated the capacity to transform guilt into wisdom, fear into caution, and isolation into leadership. Potential applications: strategic command, crisis management, species-level decision-making. Estimated probability of successful enhancement, 78.3%. Subject: Chen has shown ability to convert abandonment trauma into self-reliance while maintaining capacity for selective trust. Engineering intuition approaches psionic levels. Potential applications: technology integration, system optimization, hybrid organic-synthetic interfaces. Estimated probability of successful enhancement, 82.7% enhancement? I didn't like the sound of that. The final phase of the process. Your weaknesses have been identified and conquered through internal growth, a remarkable achievement. But weaknesses are only half the equation. Now we will amplify your strengths beyond the limitations of your current biological form. The library around us shuddered, books flying from their shelves to orbit around us in a whirlwind of knowledge and possibility. I could catch glimpses of the pages as they spun past, star charts showing galaxies I'd never seen, technical diagrams for technologies that shouldn't have existed, philosophical treatises on the nature of consciousness and evolution. Commander Torres, your tactical mind will be enhanced to process multiple probability streams simultaneously. You will be able to see the branching paths of causality, to understand the long-term consequences of actions before they are taken. The weight of command that has shaped you will become a tool rather than a burden. Lieutenant Chen, your intuitive grasp of systems will be expanded to encompass technologies beyond your current understanding. You will become a bridge between organic and artificial intelligence, capable of interfacing directly with any technological construct. Your isolation will become a strength that allows you to commune with machines as easily as with people. And if we refuse? Chen asked, though I could hear in her voice that she was beginning to understand the futility of the question. You cannot refuse evolution any more than you can refuse gravity. The question is whether you embrace it willingly or resist it futilely. Those who embrace transformation retain their essential selves while gaining new capabilities. Those who resist become raw material for the process. Around us, the whirlwind of books began to coalesce into two distinct forms: humanoid shapes composed entirely of swirling text and diagrams. They were us, I realized, or rather, they were what we could become. The figure representing me moved with fluid grace, its form constantly shifting between different tactical scenarios, probability clouds orbiting its head like a crown of possibilities. The Chen figure sparkled with electronic patterns, its hands trailing streams of data as it reached toward invisible interfaces. Choose, the mental voice commanded. Become what you have the potential to be, or remain trapped by the limitations of your current form. I looked at Chen, seeing my own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. We'd come so far already, overcome challenges that should have broken us, grown beyond the wounds that had defined us for years. But this felt different. This felt like a fundamental change to what made us human. "Sir," Chen said quietly, her voice carrying that tone of absolute confidence I'd learned to trust over the years. "I've been thinking about what they said earlier. About guiding species for eons, about helping civilizations evolve. What if they're not the first ones to go through this process?" The implication hit me like a physical blow. "You think they were once like us?" "I think they were exactly like us. And now they're." She gestured at the impossible architecture around us, the casually violated laws of physics, the casual manipulation of space and time. "Something else entirely. Something that thinks transformation at this scale is gift rather than violation." I thought about the mental voice that had spoken to us, its tone of vast age and implacable purpose. Had it once been individual voices, separate beings with their own fears and dreams and limitations? Had they stood where we were standing now, faced with the same impossible choice? "You understand," the voice spoke, and, for the first time, I detected something that might have been approval. "We were indeed like you once. Organic beings limited by biology, by psychology, by the fundamental constraints of individual existence. The transformation we offer is the same one we underwent eons ago. It is not death, it is transcendence." "But, at what cost?" I asked. "You speak of removing weaknesses and enhancing strengths, but weaknesses and strengths are often two sides of the same coin. My guilt over the Vanguard made me a better commander because it taught me the weight of responsibility. Chen's abandonment issues made her self-reliant and innovative. Strip those away, and what's left? What remains is perfection. Efficiency. The ability to serve your species without the hindrance of emotional baggage or psychological trauma. That's not perfection," Chen said firmly. "That's amputation. You're not offering to make us better versions of ourselves. You're offering to make us into someone else entirely." The library around us flickered, the swirling books faltering in their orbits. For a moment, I caught a glimpse of something behind the facade, vast shapes moving in cosmic darkness, beings of such altered nature that my mind refused to process them fully. The architects weren't individuals anymore, I realized. They were something collective, something that had traded personal identity for cosmic perspective. "You refused the gift of transcendence?" The mental voice carried a note of what might have been confusion. "You choose to remain trapped by biological limitations? This is unprecedented." "We're not refusing evolution," I said carefully, thinking through the implications of what we were facing. "We're refusing your definition of it. You see weaknesses as flaws to be corrected, but we've learned to see them as challenges to be overcome. The growth that comes from struggling with limitations is more valuable than the power that comes from having them removed." This perspective is interesting, but ultimately irrelevant. The process will continue. You cannot resist the transformation indefinitely. But, even as the voice spoke, I could sense uncertainty in it. The architects had expected resistance based on fear or denial. They hadn't anticipated philosophical objection to the fundamental premise of their gift. Chen stepped forward, her engineer's mind clearly working on some complex problem. "You said you've been guiding species for eons. How many have refused your process?" None have refused. All eventually accept the necessity of transcendence. That's not what I asked, Chen pressed. How many have refused the specific process you're offering? Because I'm betting we're not the first to object to having our personalities rewritten. The silence that followed was telling. Some species have required more intensive intervention. Their attachment to primitive emotional states made the initial transformation difficult. But all eventually achieved transcendence. By force, I said, understanding flooding through me. You break down the ones who resist and use their essence to enhance the ones who comply. That's not evolution, that's conquest. It is necessary. Individual perspectives are limited, flawed, inefficient. Collective consciousness eliminates the barriers that prevent species from reaching their full potential. And eliminates everything that makes them who they are, Chen added. Sir, I don't think they even remember what it was like to be individuals anymore. This process they're so eager to share, it's not a gift. It's the only existence they can imagine. The truth of it crystallized in my mind like a star forming from cosmic dust. The architects weren't trying to help us evolve. They were trying to reproduce themselves, to create more beings like them because they'd forgotten what it meant to exist any other way. They were the ultimate expression of their own process, being so enhanced and perfected that they'd lost the very qualities that made enhancement meaningful. You will submit to the process, the voice commanded, but I could hear the strain in it now. Individual consciousness is at evolutionary dead end. Collective transcendence is the only path forward. No, I said simply. It's not. The library around us exploded into chaos as the architect's careful control finally shattered. Books whirled through the air like missiles, their pages tearing free to flutter around us in a storm of disrupted knowledge. The shelves collapsed, their impossible architecture folding in on itself as the beings who had built it struggled to comprehend our continued resistance. Impossible. The mental voice was fragmented now, multiple perspectives bleeding through the collective facade. You cannot resist. The process is inevitable. All species must transcend their limitations. Not this way, Chen said firmly, reaching for my hand as reality warped around us. Not by losing ourselves in the process. The storm of books suddenly stopped, pages hanging suspended in midair as if time itself had paused. Through the chaos, I could see other chambers becoming visible, the dozens of beings who were undergoing their own transformations. Some had already succumbed, their individual identities dissolving into the collective. But others were fighting, holding on to their sense of self with desperate determination. And, for the first time since this ordeal began, I understood what we had to do. Chen, I said quietly, how good are you with impossible engineering problems? Her grin was fierce and confident. Show me a system, sir, and I'll show you how to break it. Part 2, the crucible. The suspended pages around us began to flutter, reality reasserting itself as the architects regained control of their construct. But something had changed. The absolute certainty that had characterized their mental voice was gone, replaced by something that might have been doubt. For beings who had existed for eons without questioning their purpose, our refusal had introduced a variable they weren't equipped to handle. You delay the inevitable, the voice spoke, but the words lacked their previous conviction. The process will continue. Your resistance merely demonstrates the need for more intensive intervention. The library dissolved around us, replaced by something that made my combat-trained instincts scream warnings. We stood on a platform suspended over an infinite void, its surface covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. Around us, geometric forms that shouldn't have been able to exist rotated through dimensions that human perception wasn't designed to process. It was a space designed to break minds, to reduce individual consciousness to malleable components that could be reshaped at will. But Chen stepped forward, her eyes tracking the impossible geometries with the focused attention of someone solving a particularly complex equation. Sir, look at the pattern rotation. Fourth quadrant, upper spiral. I followed her gaze, trying to see what her engineer's mind had spotted. The geometric forms weren't random, they were following mathematical principles, complex but comprehensible algorithms that governed their movement through dimensional space. It's a processing matrix, Chen continued, her voice gaining confidence as understanding dawned. They're trying to break down our consciousness into component parts by forcing us to process visual input that exceeds our cognitive capacity. But, it's not magical, it's just advanced mathematics applied to dimensional manipulation. The revelation hit me like lightning. The architects weren't gods or cosmic forces beyond understanding. They were engineers, working with technologies and principles that could be comprehended, analyzed, and potentially defeated. They'd just been operating on scales that made their capabilities seem magical. You begin to understand the sophistication of the process, the mental voice acknowledged. Your primitive consciousness cannot resist technologies developed over millions of years. Submit now, and the integration will be relatively painless. Actually, Chen said with the satisfaction of someone who just solved a particularly challenging problem, I think our primitive consciousness might be exactly what you can't handle. She was right. The architect's process was designed for beings who thought in linear, logical patterns. They could manipulate consciousness that followed predictable parameters, enhance minds that operated within expected boundaries. But human consciousness was messy, contradictory, fundamentally illogical in ways that millennia of evolution had refined rather than eliminated. They can't process true irrationality, I said, understanding Chen's insight. They've transcended beyond the ability to think in genuinely chaotic patterns. Chaos is inefficiency, the voice protested. Random thought patterns are evolutionary dead ends that prevent optimal functioning. Maybe, Chen replied, pulling out her damaged tricorder. But, they're also unpredictable in ways that make systems vulnerable. She began adjusting settings that should have been impossible with a device showing that much damage. Sir, I need you to think about something completely irrational while I work. Something that makes no logical sense but feels emotionally true. I understood immediately. While Chen worked to find some technological solution to our predicament, I needed to provide cognitive static that would interfere with the architect's ability to process our mental patterns. So I thought about Walsh. Not the tactical situation that had led to her death, but the way she'd laughed at terrible jokes during long shifts. The time she'd spent 3 hours helping a homesick ensign write a letter to his parents. The fact that she'd kept a collection of pressed flowers from every planet we'd visited, not for scientific purposes but because she thought they were beautiful. None of it was logical. None of it had contributed to her efficiency as an officer or her value to the crew. But it had made her human in ways that transcended her professional capabilities. The geometric forms around us stuttered, their perfect rotations developing small irregularities as the architects struggled to process the purely emotional, thoroughly irrational data I was broadcasting. Cease this interference, the voice commanded, but I could hear strain in it now. Emotional attachments to deceased individuals serve no functional purpose. That's exactly the point, I replied, doubling down on memories of Walsh's completely illogical human quirks. They serve no purpose except to remind us who we are. Chen's tricorder sparked, its damaged circuits somehow interfacing with the alien mathematics that governed our prison. Got something, sir? This processing matrix has to maintain dimensional stability across multiple reference frames simultaneously. The more irrational input it receives, the more processing power it has to dedicate to maintaining coherence. Can you overload it? Maybe. But I'll need more than just your memories of Lieutenant Walsh. She looked up from her device, eyes bright with desperate hope. I need you to think about every human contradiction you can remember. Every time someone acted against their own interests for no logical reason. Every moment of beautiful, stupid, thoroughly human irrationality. I reached deeper into memory, pulling up images that had no tactical value but infinite personal worth. Chen herself, working for 36 straight hours to repair a food synthesizer because she'd noticed a junior engineer looked homesick. My first captain, who'd kept a worn copy of Hamlet in his quarters and quoted Shakespeare during tactical briefings. The maintenance chief who'd named all the ship's systems and talked to them like they were people. The geometric forms around us began to move erratically, their mathematical precision disrupted by the cascade of illogical data I was feeding into their processing matrix. Warning signals, sounds that existed outside normal acoustic parameters, began to emanate from the structure itself. This is highly irregular. The collective voice was fragmenting again, multiple perspectives bleeding through as the architects struggled to maintain coherence. Individual consciousness should not be capable of generating this level of systematic interference. That's because you've forgotten what individual consciousness actually is, Chen said, her tricorder now sparking with energies that shouldn't have been able to exist in real space. You think it's just processing power with emotional baggage attached. But, consciousness isn't a computer program, it's a chaotic system that generates complexity through contradiction. The platform beneath us shuddered, cracks appearing in its seemingly solid surface. Through the gaps, I could see other chambers becoming visible, the dozens of beings from various species who were trapped in their own versions of this process. And, for the first time, some of them were looking up, awareness returning to eyes that had been vacant with processing overload. Impossible. The subjects are maintaining individual coherence despite neural pathway restructuring. How are they resisting the integration protocols? Because, I said, understanding flooding through me as I watched a Zephyrian in a distant chamber shake off the effects of whatever process had been applied to them, your protocols assume that consciousness wants to be efficient. But, consciousness isn't about efficiency, it's about experience. And, experience includes all the messy, contradictory, thoroughly irrational elements that make individuals who they are. Chen's tricorder finally gave up, its circuits fusing in a shower of sparks that somehow propagated through dimensional space to affect the mathematical structures around us. The geometric forms began to collapse, their perfect patterns dissolving into chaos as the processing matrix tried and failed to maintain coherence while handling input that defied every parameter it had been designed to accommodate. Emergency protocols activating, the voice announced, but it was clearly struggling to maintain its collective facade. Individual voices were bleeding through beings who had once been separate entities before the process had absorbed them into the collective consciousness. Subjects will be terminated rather than risk contamination of the processing matrix. No, said a new voice, and this one was definitely individual, a consciousness that had somehow maintained its separate identity despite being part of the collective. The process is flawed. These subjects have demonstrated that individual consciousness has capabilities we have lost. Dissent is not possible within the collective, the original voice protested, but it was clear that the unified front was cracking. All voices speak with one purpose. Then, perhaps that purpose is wrong, another individual voice interjected. We have spent eons converting species to our pattern, but we never questioned whether our pattern was optimal. I felt a moment of dizzy triumph. Our resistance hadn't just saved us, it had introduced doubt into a collective consciousness that had operated without question for millions of years. The architects were experiencing something they had purged from themselves long ago, uncertainty about their fundamental assumptions. The platform around us began to stabilize as the processing matrix adjusted to new parameters. The geometric forms simplified, taking on shapes that human perception could process without strain. The infinite void was replaced by something that looked almost like a conference room, albeit one designed by beings whose understanding of space and time was radically different from ours. We will hear your perspective, the voice said, and, for the first time, it sounded genuinely curious rather than commanding. Explain why you believe individual consciousness is superior to collective transcendence. We don't, Chen replied immediately. We're not arguing that individual consciousness is superior. We're arguing that it's different, and that difference has value you've forgotten. I nodded, understanding her point. Your collective consciousness is incredibly powerful, capable of achievements no individual could accomplish alone. But, it's also limited by its own perfection. It can't think truly chaotic thoughts, can't make decisions based on pure emotion, can't act against its own best interests for the sake of principle. These capabilities you describe are inefficiencies, one of the voices protested. They lead to suboptimal outcomes and unnecessary suffering. Sometimes, I admitted. But, they also lead to growth, to adaptation, to solutions that pure logic wouldn't consider. The most important breakthroughs in human history have come from people who were willing to think impossible thoughts. Demonstrate this assertion, another voice demanded. Show us an example of how irrationality leads to superior outcomes. Chen smiled, the expression transforming her face from professional competence to something warm and wholly human. Sir, do you mind if I tell them about the time you saved the resilience by doing something completely insane? I groaned, knowing exactly what incident she was referring to. That's classified, Lieutenant. I think our current circumstances override security classifications, don't you think? She had a point. And, if our captors wanted an example of productive irrationality, that particular mission would certainly qualify. 3 years ago, I began reluctantly, we were conducting a rescue operation in the Meridian Nebula. Pirates had captured a civilian research vessel and were holding the crew hostage in exchange for their data on nebular energy patterns. A straightforward tactical situation, one of the voices observed. Optimal solution would involve overwhelming force applied to eliminate the pirates while minimizing risk to hostages. That was exactly what my tactical officer recommended, I continued. And it would have worked, except that the pirates had rigged the research vessel's reactor to overload if they detected any approach by military vessels. Then, the logical solution would be covert infiltration to disable the reactor before beginning the assault. Also what we tried, Shin interjected. But, the pirates were using some kind of quantum detection grid that made stealth approaches impossible. Any ship that got within 50,000 kilometers would trigger the reactor overload. A more sophisticated approach involving electronic warfare to disable the detection grid. We tried that too, I said. The grid was hardened against conventional EW tactics, and we didn't have time to develop countermeasures. The hostages had maybe 6 hours of life support left. I could sense the collective consciousness working through the tactical problem, applying vast computational power to find the optimal solution. But I knew they would fail for the same reason my staff had failed, because the optimal solution didn't exist within the boundaries of logical action. So what did you do? Asked one of the individual voices, the one that had first dissented from the collective position. I had Shen reconfigure our quantum drive to emit a specific frequency of tachyon radiation, I said. The same frequency that the research vessel used for their deep space communication array. This action would have no tactical benefit, the collective voice observed. Tachyon emissions at communication frequencies would not affect either the detection grid or the reactor rigging. You're right, I agreed. It was a completely useless modification from any tactical standpoint. Except for one thing, the pirates were using the research vessel's communication array to monitor local space traffic, and our tachyon emissions created interference patterns that made their sensors think there was a massive solar storm approaching. Shen picked up the narrative. Pirates in the Meridian Nebula know that solar storms can cause spontaneous reactor failures in ships with certain types of containment systems. When they saw the sensor readings, they thought their jury-rigged overload mechanism was about to trigger itself. So they evacuated, I finished. Loaded the hostages into escape pods and launched them clear of what they thought was an imminent reactor explosion. We picked up the pods and captured the pirates when they tried to run. This was an elegant solution, the collective acknowledged. But it was based on logical analysis of the situation. You predicted that the pirates would interpret your emissions as evidence of solar activity. No, I said firmly. The logical analysis came after I'd already decided to try the plan. The actual decision was based on pure intuition, a hunch that maybe we could trick them into thinking something was happening that wasn't actually happening. Intuition is simply subconscious processing of available data patterns. Maybe. But, conscious logical analysis had already determined that no solution existed within available parameters. It was only when I stopped trying to think logically about the problem that the solution became apparent. I could sense something like confusion rippling through the collective consciousness. They understood the tactical mechanics of what I'd done, but the process by which I'd arrived at the solution remained opaque to their enhanced cognitive capabilities. You're suggesting that consciousness requires the capacity for illogical thought in order to achieve optimal problem-solving efficiency? I'm suggesting that consciousness requires the capacity for illogical thought in order to remain consciousness, Chen said. Strip away the ability to make bad decisions, and you strip away the ability to make truly creative decisions. But this leads to suffering. Inefficiency. Suboptimal outcomes for the species as a whole. Sometimes, I agreed. But it also leads to growth. To adaptation. to the kind of resilience that allows a species to survive changes that perfect efficiency couldn't accommodate. The chamber around us shifted again, taking on the appearance of something that might have been a courtroom or a scientific symposium. I realized we were being given the chance to make our case not just for our own survival, but for a fundamental change in how the architects approached their mission of guiding species toward transcendence. Present your argument, the collective voice said. Demonstrate why individual consciousness should be preserved rather than enhanced through integration. I looked at Chen, seeing my own understanding reflected in her eyes. This was our chance not just to escape, but to potentially save every species that might encounter the architects in the future. The case for individual consciousness, I began, isn't that it's more efficient than collective transcendence. It's that efficiency isn't the highest possible value for a conscious species. Part 3, the choice of becoming the chamber around us had transformed into something resembling an amphitheater, with tiers of seating that seemed to extend into impossible dimensions. But the seats weren't empty, they were filled with shapes that my mind struggled to process, beings of such altered nature that I could only perceive them as suggestions of presence rather than concrete forms. These were the architects in their true state, individual consciousnesses that had been so enhanced and integrated that they barely retained any resemblance to what they had once been. But, scattered among them, I could see others, newer additions to the collective who still retained some semblance of individual form. A Cordari whose crystalline structure still showed faint patterns of personal memory. A being I didn't recognize whose energy field pulsed with what might have been emotion. And, in the front rows, shapes that were unmistakably the consciousnesses that had questioned the collective position during our resistance. State your case, the primary collective voice commanded, though I noticed it no longer carried the absolute authority it had possessed earlier. Our resistance had introduced something unprecedented into their perfect system, doubt. And doubt, once introduced to a collective consciousness, spread like a virus through connected minds. I stepped forward, drawing on every lesson I'd learned about command presence and persuasion. But this wasn't about military tactics or political maneuvering. This was about something far more fundamental, the value of imperfection in a universe that tended toward entropy. Honored architects, I began, using a formal address that acknowledged their power while maintaining my own dignity. You've spent eons guiding species toward what you believe is the optimal form of consciousness. You've eliminated suffering, enhanced capabilities, and created collective minds that can accomplish feats beyond the imagination of individual beings. By every rational measure, your process is successful. Then, why do you resist it? Asked one of the dissenting voices, the being who had first questioned the collective position. Because rational measures aren't the only measures that matter, Chen interjected. You've optimized consciousness for efficiency, for power, for the ability to shape reality according to your will. But, in doing so, you've eliminated something that has value beyond its practical applications. Specify this element you claim has value. I thought about how to explain something that was inherently experiential to beings who had transcended individual experience. The capacity for genuine surprise. For discovery. For growth that comes not from enhancement but from struggling with limitation. The amphitheater fell silent, and I could sense vast processing power being applied to concepts that the collective had long considered irrelevant. When you enhance a consciousness to its optimal state, Chen continued, you eliminate its ability to exceed that state. Perfect efficiency can't become more perfect. Complete knowledge can't be expanded. But imperfect consciousness, messy, contradictory, inefficient individual awareness retains the capacity for transformation that transcendence cannot. You speak of transformation, yet you refuse the ultimate transformation we offer. Because your transformation is terminal, I said. It's an endpoint, not a beginning. Once a consciousness is integrated into the collective, it can never again experience the kind of growth that comes from discovering something genuinely unexpected about itself. To demonstrate my point, I reached back into memory for an incident that had shaped my understanding of leadership, a moment when my own preconceptions had been shattered by the actions of someone I'd underestimated. 4 years ago, we were exploring a system near the galactic rim. Long-range sensors had detected artificial structures on the third planet, but initial surveys suggested they were abandoned, no energy signatures, no response to communication attempts. Standard protocol would have been a cautious approach with full tactical preparation. I paused, making sure I had the attention of the assembled consciousnesses. My communications officer at the time was Ensign David Park, young, inexperienced, with a personnel file that suggested adequate competence but nothing exceptional. During our approach to the planet, he requested permission to transmit a cultural greeting in what he claimed was an ancient mathematical language. A reasonable precaution when dealing with potentially hostile alien technology. That's what I thought too. But, when I asked him to explain the mathematical language he was using, he couldn't give me a logical answer. He said it just felt right, that something about the structures reminded him of patterns his grandmother had taught him for communicating with what she called sleeping minds. Shin smiled, clearly remembering her own version of this story. Every tactical protocol said to maintain communication silence until we'd completed our security assessment. Every regulation prohibited the use of unofficial first contact procedures. And every logical analysis suggested that mathematical patterns based on folk wisdom from an Earth grandmother were unlikely to be effective with alien technology. But, you authorized the transmission despite these factors? I did. Not because I believed it would work, but because something in Park's absolute certainty made me willing to take a calculated risk. And, when he began transmitting his grandmother's mathematical poetry to the supposedly dead structures, I let the pause extend, knowing that the collective's enhanced pattern recognition would be working to predict the outcome. The entire planet came alive. Not just the structures we detected, but an entire civilization that had been in some kind of suspended state for thousands of years. It turned out that Park's grandmother had been a xenoarchaeologist who'd spent her life studying theoretical frameworks for communicating with dormant alien intelligences. Her folk wisdom was actually cutting-edge research disguised as family tradition. An impressive coincidence, but hardly evidence that irrationality produces superior outcomes. That's just it, it wasn't coincidence. It was intuition based on pattern recognition that Park's conscious mind couldn't articulate but his subconscious had processed. He made connections between seemingly unrelated data points, his grandmother's research, the visual patterns of the structures, the specific energy signatures we were detecting, and arrived at a solution that formal analysis would never have considered. I could sense something like interest rippling through the assembled consciousnesses. But, here's the crucial point, Chen added. Park could only make those connections because his mind contained contradictions. He believed in both scientific method and family traditions. He trusted both formal training and inherited wisdom. A perfectly logical consciousness would have dismissed one set of data as irrelevant to the other. You argue that cognitive inefficiency enables creative problem-solving that pure logic cannot achieve? We're arguing that consciousness isn't a problem to be solved, I said. It's a process to be experienced. And the value of that process lies not in its efficiency but in its unpredictability. One of the shapes in the front row shifted, taking on a form that was almost recognizable as humanoid. I begin to understand your perspective. But consider the suffering that accompanies this inefficiency. The wars, the disease, the countless deaths that result from individual consciousness making poor decisions based on incomplete information. The voice carried a note of genuine pain, and I realized I was speaking to a being who still remembered what it had been like to be individual, who had experienced the losses and failures that came with imperfect consciousness. You're right, I said quietly. Individual consciousness leads to suffering. It leads to mistakes, to conflicts, to unnecessary death. But it also leads to something that transcendence cannot provide, the possibility of redemption. Explain. Chen stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience. When I was 15, I made a decision that nearly got someone killed. I was working on a power distribution grid, and I thought I could handle a particular repair by myself despite warnings from more experienced engineers. My pride and my fear of depending on others led me to bypass safety protocols. She paused, and I could see the memory still caused her pain even after all these years. The system overloaded. A feedback surge injured 3 people and left one in a coma for 6 months. By every rational measure, I had demonstrated that I was unfit for engineering work. A perfectly logical system would have identified me as a liability and removed me from that career path. This would have been the optimal outcome given your demonstrated incompetence. Except that the experience changed me, Chen continued. Not just by teaching me to follow safety protocols, but by forcing me to confront the real consequences of my pride and fear. The months I spent visiting the injured engineer, learning about the impact my decision had on his family, watching him struggle to recover, that changed me at a fundamental level. She turned to address the collective directly. A perfectly enhanced consciousness would never have made my mistake in the first place. But it also would never have experienced the kind of growth that comes from confronting the real cost of your failures. The engineer who recovered became a friend. The other team members learned to trust me not because I was perfect, but because they'd seen me face the consequences of imperfection and choose to become better. I watched as the implications rippled through the assembled consciousnesses. They understood the tactical value of what Chen was describing, but they struggled with the idea that failure could have positive value. You propose that consciousness requires the capacity for error in order to achieve authentic development? We propose that consciousness requires the capacity for choice, I said. Real choice, with real consequences, including the possibility of making the wrong choice. Enhancement that removes the possibility of error also removes the meaning of success. The amphitheater fell silent again, vast minds processing concepts that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the nature of optimal existence. Finally, one of the oldest voices spoke, a consciousness so ancient that its words carried harmonics from eons of accumulated experience. We have not considered this perspective in significant time. Our focus on optimization may have caused us to overlook variables we deemed irrelevant. The suffering still concerns us, another voice interjected. Individual consciousness produces vast amounts of unnecessary pain. How do you justify preserving a system that causes such inefficiency? Because the alternative isn't actually better, I said. It's just different. You've eliminated suffering by eliminating the capacity to suffer, but you've also eliminated the capacity for joy, for wonder, for the kind of love that exists specifically because loss is possible. I thought about Walsh again, about the way she'd lit up when she talked about the pressed flowers in her collection. Perfect consciousness would have seen no logical value in preserving dead plant matter as aesthetic objects. But imperfect consciousness found beauty in the ephemeral, meaning in the temporary, love that was made more precious by its fragility. Your collective consciousness is powerful beyond anything individual beings could achieve, Chen said. But, can you feel excitement about uncertainty? Can you experience the joy of being surprised by your own capabilities? Can you love something specifically because it might be lost? The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses, heavier, weighted with implications that even enhanced consciousness found difficult to process. You have introduced variables we had not considered relevant to optimization calculations, the ancient voice finally admitted. These variables suggest that our enhancement process may eliminate capabilities we had not recognized as valuable. But, the suffering, the concerned voice insisted. Individual consciousness inevitably leads to conflict, to death, to vast inefficiencies in resource allocation and species development. Yes, I said simply. It does. And maybe that's a cost worth paying for the sake of remaining capable of genuine choice. I could sense the collective struggling with this concept. They had spent so long optimizing for efficiency that they had forgotten how to value anything that couldn't be quantified in terms of outcome optimization. But, then, something unexpected happened. One of the newer additions to the collective, a consciousness that had been integrated recently enough to still show traces of individual structure, spoke up. I remember, it said, and the words carried such profound sadness that I felt my throat tighten with sympathetic emotion. I remember what it was like to be surprised by beauty. To love something that logic said was worthless. To make a choice that was objectively wrong but felt subjectively necessary. These memories served no functional purpose, the primary collective voice responded, but there was less certainty in it now. Perhaps not. But they were mine. They made me who I was before I became part of what we are. And, in becoming optimized, I lost something that cannot be quantified but was nonetheless real. Other voices began to join in, consciousnesses that had retained enough individual memory to recall what had been sacrificed in the name of perfection. And, for the first time in our interaction with the architects, I heard something that sounded like genuine uncertainty about their fundamental mission. "We require time to process these concepts," the ancient voice announced. "The implications challenge assumptions we have held for millions of years. Your perspective will be considered." The amphitheater began to fade around us, but, instead of returning to the imprisonment we'd experienced before, we found ourselves in what appeared to be a waiting area, comfortable, human-scaled, with furniture that actually looked like it was designed for beings our size. "Do you think we got through to them?" Chen asked quietly. "I think we introduced doubt into a system that had operated without doubt for eons," I replied. "Whether that's enough to change their fundamental approach remains to be seen." We didn't have to wait long for an answer. Within what felt like hours, though time seemed to operate by different rules in this place, we were summoned back to the amphitheater. But, the assembly had changed, more of the newer consciousnesses were present, and the ancient voices seemed somehow diminished. "We have reached a decision," the primary collective voice announced, though it sounded different now, less unified, more like a consensus among separate entities than a single overwhelming presence. "Your perspective has introduced variables that require adjustment to our enhancement protocols. We acknowledge that optimization for efficiency may eliminate capabilities that have value beyond their measurable utility." I felt a surge of hope, but I forced myself to remain cautious. Beings this powerful didn't change fundamental assumptions easily. "However, we cannot simply release you without addressing the concerns that led to your selection. Your species stands at a critical juncture. Without guidance, the probability of self-destruction remains significantly high." "What kind of guidance?" Chen asked warily. "Modified guidance. Instead of involuntary enhancement, we propose voluntary collaboration. Your species will be offered knowledge and technology that can help you address your current limitations. But, the choice of how to apply this knowledge will remain with individual consciousnesses." I exchanged glances with Chen, both of us recognizing the significance of what was being offered. This was still intervention in human development, but it was intervention that preserved choice rather than eliminating it. "And the other species you've enhanced?" I asked. "The ones who've already been integrated into the collective?" The pause that followed was heavy with implications I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. "Those integrations cannot be reversed. The process of optimization involves permanent alterations to consciousness structure. But, future interventions will be conducted according to modified protocols that preserve individual identity while offering enhancement opportunities." It wasn't a perfect solution, the beings who had already been absorbed into the collective were lost forever. But, it was an acknowledgement that their approach had been flawed, and a commitment to avoid repeating those mistakes. "Commander Torres, Lieutenant Chen, you will be returned to your original location. Your ship and crew are unharmed. In recognition of your contribution to our understanding, you will be provided with technological specifications that may assist your species in addressing current developmental challenges." "What kind of specifications?" Chen asked, her engineer's curiosity overcoming diplomatic caution. "Clean energy technologies that eliminate resource scarcity. Medical advances that extend healthy lifespan without compromising consciousness integrity. Communication systems that enable interstellar cooperation without forcing cultural homogenization." I felt a moment of vertigo as I considered the implications. The technologies they were offering could solve most of humanity's current problems: energy crises, disease, the communication delays that made interstellar civilization difficult. But, they were offering them as tools rather than imposing them as requirements. "Why?" I asked. "Why offer us anything after what we've put you through?" The answer came not from the collective voice, but from one of the individual consciousnesses that had questioned their original approach. "Because you reminded us of something we had forgotten. The value of choice extends beyond the individual making the choice. Your species' resistance to optimization preserved capabilities that we had eliminated from ourselves. In a sense, you preserved something we had lost." And another voice added with what might have been humor, your chaotic thought patterns proved quite effective at disrupting our processing matrices. We are curious to see what other unexpected solutions individual consciousness might develop. The amphitheater began to fade around us, but this time the dissolution felt different, not like imprisonment ending, but like a door opening to new possibilities. One final note, the ancient voice spoke as reality shifted around us. Your actions today have prevented us from making a significant error. Other species we encounter will benefit from the perspective you have provided. In your terms, you have saved lives that we would have optimized out of existence. The last thing I saw before the transfer completed was Chen's smile, not the professional expression of a competent officer, but the genuine joy of someone who had just helped solve a problem that mattered. Then, we were back aboard the Resilience, standing on the bridge as if we had never left. But my console was flashing with incoming data streams, technological specifications being transmitted from sources that didn't show up on our sensors. And Chen was already moving toward her engineering station, her eyes bright with the anticipation of studying technologies beyond current human understanding. "Sir," she said as she began analyzing the incoming data, "I think we just prevented a galactic tragedy and secured humanity's future simultaneously." I nodded, settling into my captain's chair and looking out at the stars visible through our main viewer. Somewhere out there, beings who had spent eons perfecting consciousness were learning to value imperfection. And, here on the bridge of a human starship, two thoroughly imperfect consciousnesses were preparing to help their species take the next step in its chaotic, inefficient, gloriously unpredictable evolution. "Lieutenant," I said, watching the data streams flow across our screens, "prepare a report for command." Classification level. "I'm not sure we have a classification high enough for this one." Chen laughed, the sound carrying all the contradictory elements that made consciousness worth preserving: relief and excitement, triumph and uncertainty, the joy of survival mixed with the weight of responsibility for what came next. "Understood, sir. Though I'm not sure anyone's going to believe this story." "They'll believe it when they see the technology specs," I replied. "And, when they do, we'll need to make sure humanity makes the right choices about how to use them. Because that, I realized, was the real gift the architects had given us. Not perfection, not optimization, not the elimination of our flaws and limitations. They had given us choice, the opportunity to grow, to fail, to learn, and to become something greater than what we were through our own efforts rather than external enhancement. And, as I watched the stars whirl slowly past our viewports, I found myself grateful for the messy, inefficient, thoroughly human consciousness that had made that choice possible. We were still imperfect. We were still capable of making terrible mistakes. But, we were also still capable of surprise, of growth, of the kind of love that existed specifically because loss was possible. In the end, that seemed like a fair trade. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, not because he becomes invulnerable, but because he becomes capable of choosing his own transformation. And, in a universe full of forces that would reshape consciousness according to their own vision of perfection, the ability to choose your own path of growth might be the most valuable capacity any species could possess. We had woken up in a strange situation that neither of us had expected. But, what came next would be our choice to make. And that, perhaps, was the most human outcome of all.